In this episode, we're talking about God's providence, so sit back and stay tuned for more. Hey there, welcome to another episode of Monday Moments, the show in which we take a deeper dive into Sunday's sermon. My name is Travis, your host. With me today is Pastor James, and this is our first video in our new series entitled, How Then Shall We Live? We missed last week's because of a holiday. So we are going to recap just a little bit, but today we want to talk about God's providence. You talked about the book of Esther, and I think I can accurately say the book of Esther because you went through
about all of it.
1 through, I don't think we got all the way through 10, but you got through
we got through
7.
10. Yeah.
So
we got there.
Tell me a little bit, and for those who are watching and listening, when you were praying and feeling led to do this series, How Then Shall We Live? What were some of the things that were on your heart that led you to say, I think that this is where the Lord is wanting us to go for this moment in time?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it came out of our Sabbath series of just looking around, spending a lot of time. Kelly and I enjoyed the opportunities that we had just to have conversations. Some of them were very casual, standing in line at the grocery store or maybe in the gym and just kind of hearing where people's lives are at and what's going on. And it just seemed like as we were going through our Sabbath season that there was a lot of questions in people's minds as far as, well, what are we going to do about this situation? And a lot of conversations around kids. How are we going to raise our kids in light of these things? A lot of conversations around marriages and other relationships. And a lot of it wasn't, I wouldn't say that they were defeating conversations, but they were conversations where people were really looking to what do we do now? And I think it's an appropriate question. And I kept going back to that book by Francis Schaeffer, and the title of that book is How Then Should We Live? And I think it's an appropriate question in light of all of these other things. It doesn't mean that the challenges and the problems that we're having are not real, and it doesn't even mean that they're not significant challenges that we're facing. Yeah. But at some point, we get to the end of the conversation, and we're always left with that question: in light of all of these things, how then should we live? What are we going to do now? We can't stay here,
right?
And we're not going to go backwards. So what do we do to get moving? And so I think that's where just a lot of my heart came out of this is just helping people to see, okay, so now what? What do we do?
And I think looking at today's culture, there's a lot that can feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
And this is not to say, one side or the other. I'm just saying in general, there's a lot that's causing, I think, a lot of anxiety, frustration, concern, worry, you name it. There's a whole list of things. And even I say the secular world, the non-church world is starting to recognize it. I see articles about rudeness is on the rise, and worry, anxiety, stress, all of these things are on the rise. And it's just, everybody's noticing it. And I think, like you said, it is an appropriate question and conversation to have. And I think the amazing thing about that is, even though it might look a little different on the surface, at the core, it's not something that the Bible doesn't address. Yeah. And there are certainly situations, whether in the Old Testament or New Testament, that clearly lay out, here's how we should live in light of these things. And I think, speak into this, that's what led you into this sermon series, because you spoke last Sunday about David and a situation that he was going through, and having to ask that same question. Am I listening to this? What is going on? Is what is confronting me or in front of me? Is it from the Lord? Is it not from the Lord? And he was having to really listen to the Lord. And the same thing with Esther. What's going on in these circumstances? It seems dire. It seems overwhelming. And yet there was, in each of these stories so far, there was a moment that they said, we're going to believe God to be who he said he always would be.
Yeah, and I think that what you just said there, I think captures the heart of it. In light of these things, how are we going to? And I think that part of the problem is that we we ask this question: what are we going to do about these things? And that gives this immediate response to my immediate circumstances.
Yeah.
In light of these things, kind of looks at the circumstances and says, what are we going to do if the circumstances don't change? And I think that that's a big thing. One of them has all of the emphasis that says we have to change our current circumstances.
Yeah.
Well, what happens if we can't?
Yeah.
And if we can't change our circumstances and our position is what are we going to do about our present circumstances, then there's probably going to be a fair amount of time that we live feeling pretty defeated.
Yeah.
But if our question is, how are we going to live in light of these circumstances? If this doesn't change, what are we going to do? Yeah. And that's why I've been drawn to these statements. Like we talked about the whole book of Esther, but we really kind of narrowed it down to there's a question that Mordecai asks that gives perspective about the entire situation. It assumes God's providence.
Right.
When David responds to Abishai about whether or not he should take off Shimei's head for cursing and throwing rocks, David assumes God's providence.
Right.
And I think that if we can begin to format our life in such a way that no matter what it is that we face, it assumes God's providence. Yeah. God is in this in some way.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean, I think the question that people always ask is God causing the suffering? Is God the one that's making this happen? Suffering is a result of sin. It was before there was sin, there wasn't suffering.
Right.
Life was lived in perfection. Sin comes in and it robs, it steals, it destroys exactly what Scripture says. The enemy comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. Yeah. And that's what he did. And that's what happened when sin came in, is that suffering was introduced into God's perfect world. And so now we live in the midst of those things. And that's what Jesus promises in John 16:33. It's what James talks about. Count it all joy when you experience various trials. It's what Jesus means when it says that he's the God of all comfort. It's like you don't need comfort if there's not suffering. And, and blessed are the...
blessed are those who mourn.
Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the... I mean, all of these things, you can look at God's word, and it's constantly acknowledging the fact that these things are realities in our world. Yeah. And so if we're just looking at it in terms of how are we going to do this, something interesting, I didn't bring it up yesterday, Mordecai and Esther didn't do anything to change the government that they were in.
Yeah.
They simply assumed God's providence, and they worked with what they were given, and they worked within the circumstances that they were in. And so there's all of these things. It was like, it wasn't what are we going to do about this problem, it was there is an assumption of God's providence in all of this, and we want to be about that work.
Yeah.
And gosh, it means in light of, instead of about, what am I going to do about the situation? Rather, what am I going to do in light of? So
yeah, and I think when I look at Esther, the story of Esther, it teaches me: am I really going to trust that God is the one in control when times are not favorable for me? Because that was, the position of Mordecai, Esther, and all of the Jewish people. Times were not favorable for them.
Yeah.
And yet, it's so interesting to see that Mordecai never lost faith in God. Because, before he said, who knows, he said, if you don't rise up, talking to Esther, if you don't rise up, God's going to bring deliverance from somewhere else. Like, it's just like, we so easily jump to that statement that you mentioned, which was, who knows that maybe you were born for such a time as this.
Not born. Obtained royalty.
There you go. Thank you.
Yes. But that's what people always say.
I know.
We were born, I was born for this. Well, maybe you obtained this moment,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And Mordecai just, going back a little bit, we oftentimes gloss over the fact that Mordecai's faith didn't waver.
Yeah.
He knew that deliverance from God was going to come in some way, some form, some fashion. And I think that's the challenge for us, is when we say, I trust God to provide, whether that's finances, a solution to our problems, an answer to our prayers, whatever the situation is. Are we really going to trust ourselves to God who is faithful?
Yeah, and so excellent point, because neither Mordecai and Esther or David and Abishai, Shimei, all of the ones that were involved in these situations, they had no preconceived idea about what God was going to do. They were just satisfied that God was going to do something. We tend to read these stories with the end in mind. And so we read it and we're like, oh, well, we know what happens. We know. Remember, they didn't have a clue as to what God was doing.
Yeah.
I mean, think about Esther, this beautiful little Jewish girl. She's an orphan. She's living in exile. She's living in an area that was very, very prejudiced towards her people. And so it was a life that was marked with hardship. And now all of a sudden, this opportunity arises. And that's what it was. It was an opportunity, but they weren't looking at it as an opportunity of like, oh, maybe if you're a queen, you can save God's people.
Right.
No, it was just they were just doing kind of what was right in front of them.
Right.
And when this opportunity arose, that we don't know how long Esther had been queen by this point, but there was likely a fair amount of time that had passed, and it had just kind of been business as usual, and life was going on, and they were just kind of living in this. But all of a sudden, a moment arose the moment arose because there was a tremendous problem that was in front of them. God's people, the Israelites, these Jews that were living in exile within the Persian kingdom, had just had a declaration written that they could be murdered with no, not only would there be no prosecution against those who murdered them, but all of their belongings, everything that they had, would be taken and put into the king's treasury. And they were not allowed to defend themselves. And so they were all of a sudden confronted with something that was very, very problematic for the people.
Yeah.
And yet, as you said, Mordecai was 100% convinced that God would do something about it.
Right.
And he assumed that God might want to use them. And so they determined that they valued what God could do over what they could do.
Yeah.
And they just began to walk in those things.
Yeah. And I love that the first thing you said was the preconceived ideas of how God was going to fix this situation.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking a little bit earlier about the connection, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that, is the connection between Shimei and Mordecai.
Yeah.
Because that was something that you pointed out on Sunday that I thought was profound, and it has a lot of implications. We were talking about the comparison and contrast of David and Saul.
Yeah.
And the point that you made in your message was, had David not been listening to the Lord and only been looking at the here and the now and not considering God's got a bigger picture of my situation and all of time than I do, David likely could have had that man killed, and we wouldn't have the story. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's all of these connections throughout it. So Shimei, we find out Mordecai he's a descendant of Shimei, the one who was casting and cursing sons. But Shimei was a Benjamite. He was related to Saul. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, chosen by Samuel. Or chosen by God through Samuel the prophet to be Israel's first king, and so you have all of these connections, and so Shimei, he's angry about all of this. He's the one that curses David, does all these different things. David, through whatever it was that the Lord was impressing upon him, sharing with him in that moment, he tells Abishai, hey, we can't do this. Shimei goes on. We don't hear anything about Shimei again, and all of a sudden Shimei's name comes up hundreds of years later in relation to Mordecai, and again, son of Jair, son of Shimei, and the way that genealogies were done, it wasn't just this hard sequential order of dad, but they create this image, and so now all of a sudden we have okay. So Mordecai is a descendant of Benjamin. Saul was supposed to go fight against the Amalekites. Israel had been trying to rule out the Amalekites all this time. Haman gets introduced to the picture.
Yeah.
Haman is a descendant of he's an Agagite of the descendants of King Agag of the Amalekites. And all of a sudden we have this same this same problem that has plagued God's people from the coming out of Egypt, coming back into the picture again.
Yeah.
They come out of Egypt, destroy the Amalekites. It goes to Saul, the first king, destroy the Amalekites.
Yeah.
And there's always just this little bit of hangover. But all of a sudden we begin to see again the providence, and God continuing to come back to this place and saying, deal with this. It's time to deal with this. Finish this, complete this.
Yeah.
And we see how the line just continues to go down through generations, and there's a lot of times that there's families that they're constantly trying to do better than the generation before them, because there's things that just get passed down, and it's blessings, and it's also great burdens at times, and you see how God continues to bring the people back to these things and say, we've got to deal with these things. My desire is to eliminate these things from your life.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And one of the things that I look at that we were talking about before was looking at how obedience or disobedience can have an effect beyond that moment in time.
Yeah.
And that's certainly what happened with Saul and the Amalekites.
Yeah.
Conversely, am I using that word right?
Yeah.
Conversely, it's what happened with David. David listened to the Lord, and he obeyed. Lo and behold, now in the story of Esther, we have God's method of providence. Even though they were in the midst of situations that didn't look good, didn't look favorable, it didn't look like this was going to have a positive outcome yet, and God was in the midst of this. And I loved what you said, that God oftentimes provides in subtle ways.
Yeah.
If we will commit to the day in, day out, and I'm paraphrasing. The day in, the day out obedience, humble submission, and trust before God. God is moving and God is working, even if it's not in the big miraculous ways. And that was a big point of your message.
It has become a very common phrase for people. I'm just waiting for my miracle. And miracles are miracles for a reason. They break they break the divine order in which God has established his world.
Yep.
And what we're saying is that the only thing that can get me out of this is if God intervenes in a miraculous way. Well, God's providence oftentimes works through, I don't want to call it the mundane, but it's oftentimes the mundane. It's just the common things. It's just, I'm just going to be obedient. I'm just going to walk this out, and I'm going to trust that God is that God is a part of this. I'm going to trust that his providence to his word, that his providence to his promises is going to be the thing that carries me through these things. And so when we're always looking for the big escape, that God's going to come down and he's going to do this big thing, I think it keeps us off of the value of simple obedience. And that's what God's word says. It says that he desires obedience over sacrifice. And, and a lot of times we come and say, Lord, if you will do this, if you will change this, if you'll come down in this miraculous way,
get me out of
then
this.
I will do this. And the Lord says, well, what about obedience? Well, I'd rather sacrifice something big and you just do it all right now. What about just obeying? What about just trusting me in the midst of this? And there's something beautiful about that through the book of Esther. There was no handwriting on the wall. There was no there was no lions. There was no any of these things. It was just the providence of God being lived out in simple obedience to him over an extended period of time that resulted in in God's providence being made evident through an entire people group over centuries of promises.
Yeah.
And just an incredible story.
Yeah. It's such I love that point that you made. Just as far as, trusting in the mundane. And I don't mean trusting in the mundane, but just trusting that God is working in the mundane.
Yeah.
And that's something that you and your dad have preached on over the years is character trumps charisma every time. And character is built in that day-to-day humility and obedience and just walking that out. I know we're getting a little bit long, but at the same time, if there's somebody who's watching this or they're listening to this and they're saying, I'm having trouble trusting the Lord to provide. I can't seem to look past my current circumstances, and those could be personal, it could be the culture, it could be whatever. How would you encourage somebody to begin to just walk that out, to make that a daily part of their walk with the Lord, to trust God to provide in ways that when it doesn't look favorable, and as you mentioned, if circumstances don't change?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you don't have to be sure of the outcome to be sure of the one who holds it.
That's good.
And that was something that was there. I mean, Esther went into that throne room knowing that she could be killed. Yeah, it was within the rights of the king.
It was a possibility.
And she went in there not knowing whether or not the king would spare her life. I think it's also important to know that God still uses the ordinary. We tend to write ourselves out of the story because we think there's nothing special about me. There's nothing significant about my life. Prior to this moment, Mordecai and Esther's life was marked by suffering. It was marked by defeat. It was marked by living in exile. It was marked by being looked down upon by the community around them. And yet there came a moment because they were available. And so I would say, remain available. I was having a conversation with a young person just earlier today, and I said, stop worrying about the outcome and focus on the moment. What is God wanting to do right now? Are you looking for what God is wanting to use you in right now? And if we'll do the right now, if we'll do the today, if we'll do the moment, what we find is that we get to the end and we can see his providence all along the way. Even for Mordecai, I mean, just sitting outside the gate and hearing a threat against the king and reporting it, and all of a sudden it gets recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the King. Yeah. And then later on, through again the divine providence of God, a restless king decides that he's going to listen to the most boring thing that he can, and out of that comes a reminder: hey, this one, this Mordecai, and you just see, and they didn't know, they had no idea what God was doing and shaping, and from Vashti's refusal to come before the king, which caused her to be removed, which caused a search party for a new queen, which allowed for Esther to be placed in that position. It's just like one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. No one thing significant in and of itself, except that it resulted in God being faithful to the promise that he had made. Yeah,
that's so good. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to talk about your message. And thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Monday Moments. As always, we hope that you got something out of this. And if you did, let us know. How have you seen God be faithful to provide? We would love to hear maybe a story of that, if you'd be willing to share that, or maybe an encouragement for others who might be watching this. However you want to let us know, whether that's in the comments, an email, a message, whatever. We would just love to hear from you. As always, thank you so much again for joining us for another episode of Monday Moments, and we will see you next week.